Welcome. We'll start with the last chapter for class 10th history. In this chapter, we'll talk about the novel, society and history. In the last chapter, we talked about how print media influenced the common man, and now it was in the reach of the common man to read novels, to read articles, to read periodicals in the newspapers and so on. Now, with the invention of print culture, novels developed. Under novels, what happened was, it was basically a form of art writing where people were trying to express their emotions, their ideas, their methodology into different segments. Now, when this idea came up, the idea of novels came up, there were two things that were commonly seen. One was those who were in favor of the existing systems, and the second was a system where people were trying to oppose the existing system or bring in kind of reforms. Now, these reforms could be in the form of caste system. These could be in the form of upliftment among certain sections of the society. These could be in the form of women development or women empowerment and so on. So, these became the major focus areas for the development and writing of the novels. When novels came up, initially those were in the form of the novels that were written only for the rich or the middle class, but slowly and gradually it started to percolate to the poor people as well. It started to flow from big towns to small towns, and everyone around the nook and corner of the city or the village would now be able to read the novels. So, these novels were basically attracting the common people so that they could reveal their ideas to bring in more fluency, and were trying to bring out an expression or an opinion of some other people by means of novels. So, those were the key aspects that were being taken into consideration for the novels. In novels, there was one more interesting fact, that was the flexibility. So, writings had the flexibility, and again there was epistolary, that means certain novels were released in series, so one after the other, so part 1, part 2 or kind of volume 1, volume 2, or it would be a kind of series of articles that could be published in a paper on a weekly or a monthly basis and so on. So, those were the kind of special class or a category of novels that were released. Now, there were various novels that were given or that have been given throughout this chapter, which we have covered towards the end. So, the novel who has written that novel, the year of publication of that novel, and the basic key idea in that novel would be something that we would be discussing towards the end. Now, how does the publishing market work? During that time, Henry Fiddle's Tom Jones book novel basically came in 6 volumes, and each volume costed around 3 shillings. And that was too costly because a labor could not earn that much in a week. So, the common poor people could not afford the rate or the price at which the novels were released during that time. Therefore, the concept of circulating libraries is started, or many of the peasants or poor people tried to lend the novels for an hourly basis and could pay out by hiring on an hourly basis. So, that was another culture that started during that time. Now, why these novels became so popular? They were popular because they were absorbing, they brought out the real phenomena that existed. People were able to believe the ideas that were given in the novels during that time. It could support another person's viewpoint in the favor or against of the issue or kind of criticism that could be given up. It looked to the life as experienced by the characters of the novel. So, your perspective of looking towards the life changed during this time. It brought pleasure and joy of reading, and in rural areas people could read them aloud because many of the people were not literate. So, one who is literate would read that aloud to the other people. So, those was a kind of social networking that started. Again, as we saw, you had the grandma tales where the grandma used to tell stories to the children, but with the invention of novel, it was a kind of reverse phenomena of the grandma tale that occurred, and Children were now who were going to school were able to read and were telling stories to their grandparents about what they have read. So those were the kind of discussions that we have seen throughout this chapter. Now Charles Dickens wrote a series which was known as Pickwick Papers, and it was serialized into a magazine which was having a kind of good illustrations and could be there for weeks because it was serialized, so it was appearing every week and it lived in the mind of people for long. Similarly, his first collection was known as Bose, and Tolstoy wrote a lot on the rural life and community. So we have seen how different scholars brought out different themes from the society. Some brought out the idea of upliftment, social reform, the other brought out the perspectives of rural life, the issues of urban life, how people should live or how people should have a switch to a lifestyle. Those were the kind of ideas that were coming up. Now, as we saw in the chapter 5 and 6, we had witnessed industrialization in Europe. With the expansion of industries, there was numerous profit that was occurring to the factory owners. The city was expanding, but on the other side, issues of unemployment was also rising. To address these, novels became a major source of inspiration. So the readers were based not only in the cities but also in the countryside area. They were trying to bring out the positives of industrialization and the negatives. We will see how Charles Dickens in one of his articles explained the issues that could be emerged from the problems of industrialization. Now Thomas Hardy wrote about the declining rural culture in England because of the advent of industrialization. So how things changed in the rural area during that time. Now when it comes to women, the things were pretty different because women now were coming into the field of novelists. So many of them were novelists, they were allowed to speak, they had their authority, they had their own ideas and vision. So those were coming up in the papers or in the novels. So George Eliot, the pen name of Mary Ann Evans, was a popular novelist and she had a special opportunity to express the ideas. So she mainly wrote or believed in fiction and said that women can equally participate in writing fiction as compared to men. After colonization, novels developed, and even the regions where colonies had developed, the Englishmen considered themselves to be a superior clan, and all the novels that were coming up from Britain reflected that feeling. So the idea developed in the local people and the novels started to come up in the vernacular languages, in the local languages. There are good examples to sustain this. Later in this chapter we will see there are some of the novels which came up from Britain or England, and when they reached Malayalam in the regions of Kerala, people did not like the way the novel was represented. So rather they believed that if that scenario was a story of Malayalam or was a story in Malayalam or a story of Kerala itself, it would be more appealing to the common people there. So as a result, what happened was people started to come up in their own languages. So novels became an idea where people started to explain themselves in their own languages. So Ban Bhatt's Kadambari was written in Sanskrit. Then you had Panchatantra, which was the tales written in Persian and Urdu, which were known as Dastan. Similarly, you had new forms of novels that were developed in Bengali and Marathi. So you have numerous examples that happened in India. Harish Chand was a pioneer of Hindi literature, and he translated many of the works from English to Hindi or from other languages to Hindi, and he encouraged many writers to write on numerous contents during that time. Similarly, the first novel in Assam was written by missionaries. Now, two of them were translations of Bengali, which were Fulmani and Karuna. Similarly, you had Assamese student who formed the Assam Bhaskar Unnati Sadan that brought out the journal known as Jonki. So those were the kind of examples that came up. Similarly, when you are talking about Bengali novels, what happens is, in these novels, what they were trying to depict was the past, the various characters, the various events and the historical life that they were trying to explain. The inner world of the domestic life was also an important aspect that was explained. Now, how these novels were used? These novels were used to create awakening in the society, bring out social change, social reform, bring out or establish our relationship with the past, have a kind of feeling of collectiveness or a sense of collective belonging, changing the way how people spoke about certain religion. The ideas that were represented by the various characters became important source of inspiration for many. Those who were adherent followers of some of the novels tried to replicate their behavior in the way the characters in that novel do. So those were some of the classic implications that the novel had on the common life or the common citizen. Now, what was the idea or why common people were trying to move out towards novels? As we saw in the last chapter, in the last two chapters about industrialization, with industrialization the feeling of individualism came up. With the individualism, what happened was people were having a kind of individualistic lifestyle where they were more alone. So reading became a favorite pastime. With reading, people were enjoying reading not only in isolation but also in the public spaces or the crowded spaces, because it gave them a feeling of imagination or daydreaming. Many of the women were trying to write about social issues, social reforms. So those were some of the important developments that took place. Now we have a list where you have the author, novel and the date and the key aspect of that novel. Now in this novel, it was the life of a young miner in France that was explored, and the harsh conditions that miners have to face during their life. Similarly, in this story, you have Henchard, who was initially a grain merchant, later who converted into a mayor of Casterbridge, and the novel is named as Mayor of Casterbridge. He was independent minded. He was both unpredictable in the sense that he was sometimes generous, sometimes he was very cruel, and that was the story. But he is no match to his manager, who was Donald during that time, and he can see how Henry mourns the losses of being personalized or seeing a world with a different view. Now Kipling's Jungle Book talks about a kind of adventure book where he brings out the feeling of powerfulness, assertiveness, independence and daring. Similarly, Henty's Drake Flag is an adventure novel for boys, mainly based on excitement and adventure. So he talks about setting up the empires in Mexico, Alexandria, Siberia and other countries. He talks about how English courage is represented in the novel. The next are some of the stories from US. Then you have Robinson Crusoe. Now Crusoe here is an hero of the whole novel, and he is basically an adventurer and a slave trader. So when he lands, he feels that colored people are not as equal to those people, and he considered those colored people as inferior and called them as natives, or gives them the name as Friday, which was basically unacceptable behavior as most of the writers saw in the colonial world. So those were the ideas that were brought about by the English people, who basically believed that the world they are colonizing is less civilized. Similarly, you have Baba Padmanabh. He was basically a novelist from Marathwada, and he wrote in Marathi. So it's basically about the plight of the widows. Then you have the next novel that's not a kind of realistic novel. The novel by Rishbud, it's again a Marathi novel with various events. Now this Chandu Menon's novel is the novel I was initially mentioning, where we talked about how the English novels were not adopted in the Kerala or in the Malayalam culture, and they considered those novels to be boring. Menon brought about his own novel, which was Indulekha, which was the first modern novel in Malayalam. Similarly, you had Veer Salingam, who brought out a novel. He was basically from Andhra Pradesh. He initially tried to translate the Oliver Goldsmith's novel, but later he brought about a Telugu novel in the name of Rajashekara Karimattu. Then you had the Srinivas Das novel Pariksha Guru. Now in this novel, he is trying to explain the young men of a kind of well-to-do family against the dangerous influence of bad company and loose morals. So with bad company and loose morals, you might have a change in your inner and outer feelings, and that is why he emphasizes on preserving the cultural identity. This novel talks about, the novel of Chandrakanta talks about the elements of fantasy, and this was a kind of very popular novel in Hindi language. Again was written in Nagari script. Premchand's novel of Sevadhan is a kind of storytelling novel, and this novel talks about fantasy. It's a kind of very simple novel which focuses on the social issues, basically the poor condition of the women. The Bardoli's novel was basically a historical novel in Assam. So he talks about the stories that he had heard from the old soldiers. Bankim Chandra Chattopadhyay's Durgesh Nandini is a very popular novel, and that talks about a kind of gathering of people who were stunned to realize that the Bengali novel has achieved a good excellence, and this is basically using a prose style mainly, that is language associated with a woman's speech. So again it's important. So here basically what you have to understand is why, in what all perspectives the different novels came in, why they were important, the name of the novel, the author of the novel for the short answer type questions. So similarly, Rokia Hussein's Sultana Dream, this is a novel which she had written after she was widowed, and her novels are basically satiric in approach. Padmarang is another of her novel that shows there is need for improvement of women condition. The next is the Rao's novel Indira Bai. Now here this novel again talks about the status of education among women and how with continuing education they could succeed. So Chandrababu Menon's Indulekh is another important novel. So under Indulekh he is trying to explain how Nathumbari Brahmins and Nayars was a kind of conflicting ideas, had conflicting ideas. Nathumbari Brahmins considered themselves to be superior. However, Nayars over the time generated more knowledge and wealth, and they could stand at par, and how this woman Indulekha was trying to marry a Nayar man who, Madhwan, who basically joined the civil services later. Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice, one of the very famous novels, it talks about good marriages and how to find a kind of wealthy husband. Then you have Bronner's Jane Eyre. Now Jane was a kind of independent and assertive person, and she was a girl who believed that her aunt was deceitful, and she would not believe in her aunt anymore and would stand against her. Ramashankar Ray's novel were basically in Odia, and those were kind of dramatic novels that have been written. Again you had Senapati's novel in Odia that have been written, which have been translated as 60 acres and 32 decimals of land. So it talks about the question of land and possession of land. Charles Dickens' Hard Time is a very important novel that talks about the issues of industrialization and how this industrialization has affected Coketown, which is a kind of fictitious industrial town that he had created in his novel. His novel Oliver Twist is again important, that talks about the impact of urban life under capitalism. Mullen's Biraban is again an important article. This was the first novel which was written in Bengali, and it talks about how she wrote in secret. The next is Berman's article. She talks about how the fishing community works, and slowly and gradually they get educated, and it's basically as the river dries, the community dies. So that's the sole idea of how the generation of Malas developed over time and the tragedies they have received. Kunjambu, he basically was from an untouchable caste, and he talks about the caste oppressions, that oppressiveness that was present there. Bashir was basically one of the Muslim writers and the earlier novelist in Malayalam language. Mukhopadhyay's book was very interesting. He basically talked about how Shivaji was trying to persuade Aurangzeb for a peace treaty, and Shivaji basically escapes and returned to battle. So that was the total idea of this novel, and he was trying to talk about the freedom of Hindus. Pillai's novel was again based on the fishing community of Kerala. You had Bankim Chandra Chattopadhyay's Anand Math that talked about the Hindu militia that fights the Muslim to establish a Hindu kingdom. So Premchand's Rangbhumi, again very important. It talks about the life of Surdas, who was basically blind and as well as untouchable, and how caste upliftment could take place. Premchand's Godan is again important. It talks about the life of a peasant, the Hori and his wife Dhania, and how the bureaucrats and those in power formed a network for oppression against the lower caste. Rabindranath Tagore's Ghare Bhare is again important. So, in this he basically talks about nationalism, about the man-woman relationship and the improvement in the society. So, establishing self-establishment, self-esteem and self-worth was the main idea for this novel. So, those are some of the important novels that have been covered in this chapter. If you have any doubts, you can leave those as comment below the video. We will be covering a summary of all the 8 chapters of class 10th history in one of our upcoming webinars. So, stay tuned for that. That would be very useful to have a quick revision for all the 8 chapters. Have a very good day ahead.